Eli Manning stepped away from the NFL with a legacy that American football history is forced to acknowledge with absolute respect. 2 Super Bowl championships, 2 times named MVP of the biggest game in American sports, the only one in his generation to beat Tom Brady and the New England Patriots twice on the grandest stage when they were at the peak of their power. More than 16 seasons, wearing the same New York Giants uniform, more than 57,000 passing yards, more than 360 touchdown passes, one of the longest and most durable consecutive starts, streaks in NFL history at the quarterback position, where every hit could end a career. His jersey was retired forever, as a symbol of rare loyalty in the era of big-money sports. Eli stood under the Super Bowl lights, carrying the expectations of America's toughest city on his shoulders, and walked away with a career that many only dare to dream about in silence. On paper, he was a complete champion. Enough titles, enough historic moments, enough durability to become an inseparable part of the modern NFL. But behind those cold numbers was a spiritual life far from as glorious as the record reflected. Because to stand firm amid those victories, Eli Manning had to live 2 parallel lives for 30 years, not by choice, but because if he didn't, he couldn't have survived. One Eli for the public, calm, soft-spoken, always taking responsibility, always smiling in the face of criticism, always standing tall after every mistake, accepting being called mediocre, lucky, or just protected by circumstance. And another Eli, hidden deep behind closed doors, where every comparison to his brother, every doubt about his ability, every loneliness of a man never allowed to show weakness, all piled up into a silent burden. He never broke down in public, never let emotion escape that composed face, but that wordless resilience wore him down in ways very few people recognized. If a man never breaks, who will ask why he's exhausted? If a person always stands firm, who will see the price they paid to never fall? Eli Manning's double life wasn't a sensational secret, but a cold survival mechanism, where willpower was forged through prolonged endurance, where pain wasn't allowed to make a sound, and where a man lived fully for victory, but had to sacrifice the right to live as a human being with only one life. If you want to understand why behind those resounding victories was a life that was never fully lived, please subscribe to the channel and continue joining us in the next part. Eli Manning was born into a family where being ordinary was never considered a destination. From a very young age, the Manning household was a space where every story revolved around football, where names weren't mentioned to boast, but as a pre-written destiny. Dad was Archie Manning, who once carried an entire team on his shoulders, carrying both the reputation and the regret of a career that wasn't complete but full of pride. Big brother was Peyton Manning, a prodigy who bloomed early, a man who just had to step onto the field to make the world pay attention. In that context, Eli grew up never lacking love, nor facing any harsh imposition. No one told him he had to become great. No one forced him to win, and that very kindness became a silent pressure, deeper and more enduring than any command. Because when not forced, Eli understood that every choice was his own, and if he wasn't special enough, he would just be the leftover name in a family that was already too brilliant. Eli didn't go through childhood tragedy, no defining shock to turn him into a victim or a hero, but precisely because of that, he had no emotional escape to justify hesitation, unspoken fear. In those quiet evenings, when Peyton was mentioned with clear pride, when Dad's story became the standard, Eli learned an important lesson no one taught. If you want to survive, best not to take up space. He observed more than spoke, listened more than demanded, and gradually formed a dangerous but safe habit, shrinking himself. No one in the Manning family belittled Eli, but no one could give him the feeling that just being Eli was enough. Specialness in that house wasn't declared. It floated in the air, in the way everyone expected from themselves. And Eli, with the intuition of a sensitive child, soon understood that to be accepted, he had to learn not to bother, not to cause trouble, not to demand attention. He didn't compete with his brother, didn't try to stand out in front of Dad, but chose a quieter path, becoming the one who's always okay, always easygoing, always ready to step aside. Over time, that became instinct. While other kids sought recognition by making noise, Eli sought safety by staying silent. While others learned to express themselves, Eli learned to control emotions, hide insecurity, and accept that some lives weren't meant for the center spotlight. No one in the Manning family intended to erase Eli, but the greatness of those around him made him gradually erase himself without realizing it. He grew up in an environment full of love, but missing one crucial thing: the right to be ordinary. Because, in a family where everyone had to be special enough, ordinary wasn't a choice, it was a fear. And from very early on, Eli Manning learned to live with that fear by accepting it, by not demanding more than he was allowed, by becoming the son who didn't cause worry, the brother who didn't invite comparison, the boy who didn't disappoint the family. That wasn't weakness, it was adaptation. But it was from that very adaptation that a process of self-erasure began, slow, persistent, almost invisible, laying the foundation for a later life where Eli would continue living by the same principle: survive first, and being seen or not perhaps mattered less than not being eliminated. If the Manning family was a place where ordinary had no standing, then Peyton Manning was the silent yardstick that ensured Eli could never step out of that invisible shadow. Peyton did nothing wrong. On the contrary, he did everything too right, too excellently, too early, too clearly. From a very young age, Peyton was the perfect model of an American quarterback. Smart, decisive, articulate, natural leader, winning as if it were obvious. Every time Peyton stepped onto the field, the world found an easy story to tell: genius, heir, born to lead. And every time that story was repeated, even if unintentionally, Eli was pulled in as the remainder of a comparison he never asked for. No one said Eli was worse, but no one said Eli was enough. He became the younger brother, the other one, the different version phrases that sounded neutral but accumulated into a lifelong sentence. Peyton won, and the world asked, "What about Eli?" Peyton was praised, and Eli was looked at with scrutiny. Peyton failed, and Eli was dragged out to measure whether anyone in this family could do better. In every scenario, Eli always appeared after, always as the point of comparison, always placed in a frame he had no right to escape. The cruelest part was that Peyton was never an opponent. Eli didn't compete with his brother. He admired Peyton, respected Peyton, and understood clearly that what his brother achieved was the result of undeniable talent and work. But precisely the purity of Peyton made Eli's pain harder to name, because there was no one to blame, no betrayal, no oppression, just a quiet truth. When one person in the family is too great, the others will forever be measured by his shadow, no matter how well they do. The media soon recognized this and turned it into the easiest story to sell. They didn't need to attack Eli. Just placing him next to Peyton was enough. Not as smart, not as sharp, not as much of a leader, not as charismatic. Those words, repeated over the years, gradually shaped how all of America saw Eli Manning. Not as an individual, but as a subtraction. Eli didn't lose in reality, but in others' eyes, he never won. Every step forward Peyton took brought an invisible step back for Eli in public perception. And the most painful thing was that Eli understood it perfectly, but had no way to fight back without hurting the very brother he loved. He couldn't rebel, couldn't deny that bond, couldn't say he was good enough without being seen as jealous or weak. So, Eli chose silence. Once again, he learned to stand next to Peyton with the proper smile, with the expected humility, with the ideal younger brother role in the eyes of family and public. But inside, every one of Peyton's successes left a small scratch, not from envy, but from reminding Eli that all his own efforts, no matter how serious, would always be viewed through someone else's lens. He began to doubt his own value, not because he was lesser, but because he was never evaluated independently. In a world with room for only one central story, Eli was pushed into satellite position, orbiting a light that wasn't his. The older he got, the deeper that wound cut. It didn't explode, didn't scream. It quietly shaped his personality, choices, and even how Eli saw himself. He didn't allow himself too much confidence, didn't allow himself to demand recognition, didn't allow himself to believe that if one day he won, it would be enough to erase all comparisons. Because Eli early understood a bitter truth. In the world's eyes, he didn't need to lose to be considered the one behind. As long as Peyton continued to exist as the standard, Eli would forever be measured by that standard. This was the central psychological wound of Eli Manning's life, a wound that left no external scar but silently controlled every step afterward. It taught him to endure in silence, to live with the feeling of always missing something, and to accept that some battles couldn't be won, not from lack of ability, but because the rules were set long before. And from that moment, Eli's double life was no longer just adaptation. It became a prolonged state of existence, where he had to be himself, while also being the shadow the world needed for Peyton's story to keep shining. Entering college, Eli Manning carried baggage no one could see. The desire to be evaluated as an independent person, not as the lingering shadow of his family. Ole Miss wasn't the biggest stage in America, but for Eli, it was the place he hoped to start over, where the gap between the Manning name and his own self could be widened just a little. On the field, Eli played seriously, disciplined, and steady. He didn't show off, didn't take excessive risks, didn't chase shocking moments to get attention. Eli's passes were accurate, his decisions safe, and the team stayed balanced because of that during tough times. But that very steady quality became the problem. In a sports culture always hungry for game changers, Eli was seen as a pacekeeper, not a game breaker. Scouts, analysts, and the media started using the same cold language when talking about him. Safe, average, limited ceiling. Those words weren't malicious, but they carried terrifying weight, because they didn't just judge performance, they framed his future. Safe meant he wouldn't make the team collapse, but he also wouldn't be the one to elevate it to new heights. Average meant good enough, but not worth betting on. Limited ceiling meant no matter how hard he tried, he could only go so far, to a point already drawn in advance. For Eli, this was the first time in his life he directly faced a bitter truth. Effort didn't guarantee recognition. He trained harder, studied film more thoroughly, took more responsibility on the field, but the story about him didn't change. Peyton was still the genius, Archie was still the icon, and Eli was still the steady one. Each week that passed, Eli stepped onto the field, determined to prove he could do more than that. But each week that passed, the evaluations circled back to the same point. No media explosion, no shift in perception, just patience tested bit by bit. The pain wasn't in being criticized, it was in the feeling that he was trying his absolute hardest in a game where rewards and punishments weren't based on effort. Eli began to understand that in the world of elite football, hard work was only the bare minimum. To be trusted, people needed a story, a glow, a moment that made the whole room go quiet. And Eli, with his cautious and reserved nature, wasn't born to create those kinds of moments. He didn't get angry at those evaluations, didn't publicly push back. Instead, he swallowed them, just like he'd done with every comparison before. But this time, the wound cut deeper, because it no longer came from family or mass media, it came from the people supposedly most knowledgeable about football. The people with the power to decide his future were saying, very calmly, that his effort might not be enough, and might never be enough. Ole Miss became the place where Eli learned a lesson not written in any textbook. You can do everything right, but the world doesn't owe you recognition. You can prepare meticulously, play smart, stay disciplined, and still be seen as someone who doesn't change the game. That was the first moment Eli clearly felt the cold injustice of the system he was entering, where a person's value wasn't measured by endurance, but by the ability to create excitement. And right there, in those seemingly peaceful college years, a new layer of tragedy began to form. Not loud, not dramatic, but enough to shake the young belief that just trying hard would be enough to be seen. Eli Manning left Ole Miss with a resume good enough to move forward, but also carrying the first crack in how he viewed the world. It turned out some limits were imposed not by ability, but by how others decided to tell your story. NFL Draft Day was supposed to be the moment of liberation, the end of years of doubt, and the door opening to a new future. For Eli Manning, it became the day everything started to break in an irreversible way. When his name was called at the top pick, it wasn't applause that rang out first, it was tension thickening the air. The San Diego Chargers selected Eli, and in that very moment, a decision was made, not loud, not with big statements, but enough to make all of America turn its back. Eli wouldn't go to San Diego, not because he looked down on the team, not because he feared the challenge, but because he understood very clearly what he was facing. If he stepped into an environment where he didn't believe he could survive, his football life would end before it even began. But that understanding wasn't heard. The media didn't care about quiet reasons. They saw only one thing: a young man rejecting the fate the system handed him. And so, the story was told in the simplest, cruelest way. Eli Manning was branded arrogant, called weak, seen as a spoiled product of a powerful family, not brave enough to take on his first real challenge. In the public's eyes, he was no longer the steady quarterback from Ole Miss. He became the symbol of privilege and avoidance. No one wanted to hear that the decision was made in pain, that it wasn't running away but the only gamble to survive. Eli didn't push back. He didn't stand up to explain, didn't try to rewrite the story. He chose silence, as he'd been used to doing since childhood, believing time and actions would speak for him. But silence in that moment wasn't humility. It was stepping into the eye of the storm. New York appeared as the only escape, but it wasn't the easier path. It was the path with no way back. That city didn't forgive, didn't have patience, and had no concept of waiting. If San Diego was an uncertain risk, New York was a suspended sentence, where every mistake would be magnified, every failure chewed over without mercy. Eli understood that. His family understood that. And that's why choosing New York wasn't arrogance. It was the desperate act of a man who knew that if he had to be hated, better to be hated in a place that wouldn't let him hide. But America didn't see that desperation. They only saw a guy rejecting the first team that picked him and entering the NFL with the problem child label before throwing a single pass. From that moment, Eli officially stepped into a life of public hatred. Not because he'd failed, but because he'd dared to go against the order. Every eye following him no longer held curiosity. It held anticipation for a fall. People wanted to see him pay for his decision, wanted to see him exposed as protected, but lacking guts. And Eli, once again, had no choice but to keep living his double life. On the outside, he appeared calm, answered questions briefly, took responsibility without arguing. On the inside, he walked a thin wire, where any mistake could confirm everything people already believed about him. Draft day. For many players, the start of a dream. For Eli was the day he was stripped of the right to be doubted harmlessly. From then on, every failure of his would no longer be a rookie's failure. It would be proof of a story already written. And in that prolonged silence, Eli Manning realized something painful, Some decisions don't need to be wrong to make you the hated one. And once America turns its back, you have only one way to survive. Keep walking. Don't beg for forgiveness, and accept that the road ahead will be paved with the doubt of an entire nation. New York didn't welcome Eli Manning like a rookie, nor did it grant him the right to learn in quiet. The city greeted him like a defendant already convicted, just waiting for the day he stepped onto the field to prove the verdict right or wrong. New York press didn't care about his Ole Miss past, had no patience for needs, time stories, and had even less sympathy for a quarterback who entered the league by rejecting the first team that drafted him. Every morning, Eli's name appeared in the papers with the same tone: doubt, sarcasm, and waiting. Talk shows turned him into the easiest topic, where hosts could freely ask if the Giants had made a historic mistake, if this Manning kid was really worthy of the spot or just a product of the bloodline. Fans, already worn out from years of failure, dumped their anger on a fresh face who hadn't proven anything yet. And Eli, from those very first weeks, understood that New York wasn't a place to be waited on. It was a place to survive day by day. On the field, bad throws were no longer technical errors to fix, they became evidence. Every interception wasn't just replayed on sports highlights. It lived in every debate, every analysis show, every barroom story. They were clipped, zoomed in, repeated, as if each mistake represented his entire being. People didn't say Eli was young. They said he was weak. They didn't ask if the system had issues. They asked when the Giants would find a replacement. Interceptions became weekly sentences, reissued regularly, no jury needed. And in that storm, Eli had nowhere to hide. After every game, win or lose, he still had to stand at the microphone, facing questions sharp as knives. Are you good enough? Do you feel you deserve this spot? Where do you think the Giants went wrong? Eli answered in an even tone, choosing each word carefully. No defiance, no blame, no letting emotion show. That composure, instead of earning respect, was interpreted as coldness, even indifference. People wanted to see him hurt, wanted to see him react, wanted to see him break, so they'd have more to dissect. But Eli didn't give them that, and that very restraint made him more isolated. Each game passed like a 3-hour trial, where he was both witness and defendant. Each sack didn't just hurt his body, it dug deeper into the feeling of being doubted. Each boo at home was a reminder he was never truly accepted. His professional dignity was torn apart week by week, not by one fateful big mistake, but by a series of very human moments viewed through the cruelest lens. Eli began to understand that in New York, there was no such thing as still learning, only enough or not enough. And he, no matter how hard he tried, seemed always kept on the edge of that not enough. He went home after every game with bruises on his body and a deeper, harder-to-name exhaustion, not tired from playing, but from having to hold himself upright in an environment always waiting for him to collapse. He didn't complain to family, didn't seek pity from teammates. He kept showing up early to practice, leaving late, doing exactly what was asked, as if persistence long enough would change how the world saw him. But New York didn't work that way. It didn't reward endurance, it rewarded explosion. And Eli, with his cautious and reserved nature, wasn't born to explode the way this city demanded. So each week that passed, he learned another painful lesson about the cost of not meeting cultural expectations. He became a mirror for others to dump collective disappointment on. A quarterback, easy to criticize for lacking angry gestures. No excuses, no memorable pushback. His silence made people believe he didn't care, when, in reality, it was the only way he didn't shatter. Eli Manning lived those early New York years like a man walking through a minefield, every step careful, knowing one slip could detonate the whole pre-written story about him. And the cruelest part was he couldn't prove his worth just by not making mistakes. He had to win, had to create historic moments, had to do something big enough to force this city to shut up. Until that happened, if it ever did, Eli could only keep enduring. Each game was another time he was stripped bare in public, not as a human still learning, but as an idea being tested in front of millions. And in that endless harshness, Eli gradually understood that New York wasn't just testing his talent, it was wearing him down to see if he had what it took to survive. After those first years in New York, Eli Manning realized a truth no coaching manual ever taught. In this city, fighting back isn't always strength, and silence is sometimes the only way to survive. He didn't choose silence out of cowardice, nor because he lacked words. He stayed silent because he knew any explanation would be twisted, any emotion exaggerated, and any self-defense turned into evidence against himself. So, Eli chose the harder path. Stand tall, bow his head just enough, answer briefly, take responsibility like a reflex, then walk away. Not once did he stand in front of cameras to say he was hurting. Not once did he mention the pressure. Not once did he point out the flaws in the system or the mistakes that weren't solely his. He understood that New York didn't need the full truth. They needed a target. And if he'd been placed in that spot, at least he wouldn't hand them more ammunition. Silence became the only armor he had. It carried him through freezing press conferences where every question carried the assumption that he was the problem. It helped him survive the nights coming home with an empty mind, the booze still ringing in his ears. It helped him step back onto the field the next Sunday, as if the previous week had never happened. But every layer of armor comes with a price. Each time he swallowed a word he wanted to say, a piece of Eli's sense of self wore away a little more. He began to believe his emotions didn't matter, that if he hurt, it was his private business, that his only job was not to bother the world with that pain. Gradually, silence stopped being a strategy and became a habit. He wasn't just silent with the press, he became silent with himself. He didn't allow himself to name the exhaustion, didn't permit himself to acknowledge how deeply the constant doubt had carved into him. In the locker room, he was the first in and last out, doing exactly what was asked. No complaints, no demands. On the practice field, he repeated the basics like a ritual of atonement, believing that if he was disciplined enough, the world would have to recognize it. But the world doesn't run on that kind of fairness. The more silent he stayed, the more he was interpreted differently. People said he lacked fire. People said he wasn't hungry enough. People said he didn't care. And Eli, once again, didn't push back. He understood that arguing about feelings in an environment that worships aggression would only make him more isolated. But in that prolonged silence, something dangerous happened. Eli began to lose connection with himself. He no longer knew what was real emotion and what was the necessary mask. He got so used to standing at the microphone and answering like a rehearsed script that sometimes he wasn't even sure he still had the right to react like a normal human being. On long nights, when everything quieted down, he lay there with an uncomfortable emptiness, not from lack of success, but from lacking a place to put the pain. He didn't want to become a victim, but he also didn't want to become the emotionless wall people had labeled him. Yet between those two choices, he saw no third path, and so he kept silent. The silence helped him survive in a brutal environment, but it also slowly killed the part of him that needed to be acknowledged. With each game that passed, Eli fulfilled his role perfectly on the outside, but inside, the feeling of being diminished never went away. He became someone very good at enduring, but increasingly poor at living. No one saw the moments he wondered if he was trading too much, just to hold on to a spot that had never truly felt like his. No one heard the unspoken questions about his own worth when every effort was put under the microscope of doubt. And Eli didn't let anyone hear them, because if he opened his mouth, if he admitted he hurt, the whole structure he'd built to survive might collapse. So he continued that mute path, day by day, believing endurance was his highest virtue. But deep down, he also understood something terrifying. Each day spent in silence, he still stood firm. But the price was a piece of his identity eroded almost beyond recognition. Super Bowl 42 came to Eli Manning not as a reward, but as a final trial he was forced to enter, even though he'd never asked for a hearing. The opponent was the undefeated New England Patriots, the team carrying the most perfect story the NFL had ever seen. A flawless season. Tom Brady, at the peak of his power. A dynasty ready to be canonized. And Eli stepped into that game with the familiar image from years before. The doubted quarterback. The unstable element on a team that had exceeded expectations. No one believed the Giants could win. And if anyone did, they didn't believe Eli would be the one to decide it. He took the field with that familiar calm face. But inside, it was something else entirely. No more room for strategic silence, no margin for error. This wasn't just a game. This was the last chance to survive in the story others had already written about him. The game unfolded like a prolonged, nerve-draining battle. The Patriots dominated in reputation, in expectations, in collective confidence. The Giants were seen as uninvited spoilers. With every play, Eli had to perform feeling that one mistake would turn all those years of endurance into convicting evidence. And then the moment came, not in perfect control, but in chaos. Pressure collapsed. Defensive arms closed in. Eli was nearly swallowed. He escaped by survival instinct more than textbook technique. The ball was thrown in desperation. The helmet catch happened like something absurd, a moment no one dared dream of, an image that would be replayed thousands of times afterward. To many, it was a miracle. To Eli, it was the moment he kept his story alive. Not glory, but survival. The Giants scored the winning points. The Patriots fell. The world paused for a few seconds. Eli Manning became a Super Bowl champion, but the moment the final whistle blew, a cold paradox began to form. Instead of ending the doubt story, that victory opened a new chapter of it. The public didn't talk about Eli as the man who led his team past the greatest dynasty in history. They talked about luck. They talked about the defense. They talked about the helmet catch, like a statistical fluke that could never be repeated. They said anyone in that position could have won. Eli was given the MVP award, but it came with a sense of reluctance, as if the world had to acknowledge the result but refused to acknowledge the man behind it. The media quickly worked to restore the old order. Brady remained the center of the story, the Patriots the standard, and Eli just a lucky interloper on one unlike any other night. For Eli, this was the cruelest moment, because he'd done what people said he couldn't. He'd stood firm in the biggest game of his life, hadn't collapsed, hadn't made a fatal mistake, and seized the moment when it arrived. But that still wasn't enough to change how the world saw him. The victory didn't erase years of doubt. It only temporarily covered them with a thin layer of light. Eli returned to the locker room with the Lombardi Trophy, but also with the familiar feeling. He'd won the biggest game of his life, but still hadn't won the story about himself. In the days that followed, as the celebration images faded, the old questions returned. Could he repeat this? Was this just a one-off moment? Did the Giants win because of Eli or in spite of him? Eli didn't answer. He continued his silence, as he had throughout his career. But this time, the silence carried a different pain. The pain of reaching the peak, and still not being allowed to step out of the shadow. Super Bowl 42 didn't free him. It only raised the expectations and doubts to a higher level. From then on, he didn't just have to prove he was good enough. He had to prove that victory wasn't an accident. Deep down, Eli understood that the helmet catch moment would follow him for life, not just as a symbol of victory, but as a reminder of how the world chose to see him. A survival moment interpreted as luck, a perfect game reduced to one play, and a human being shrunk into a convenient story. He didn't resent it. He didn't celebrate too long either, because deep inside, he clearly felt the road ahead hadn't changed. This win wasn't the end. It was just a brief pause in the long journey of endurance. Eli Manning walked out of Super Bowl 42 with a championship ring on his finger, but also with a colder truth etched deeper than ever. In this world, you can beat the undefeated team, you can create a historic moment, and still not be allowed to define yourself. After Super Bowl 42, people said Eli Manning had finally been freed. They said the victory closed every debate, that the championship ring had answered all those years of doubt. But reality didn't play out that way. When the stadium lights went out and the new season began, Eli realized a much colder truth. Victory only bought temporary silence, never lasting trust. Interceptions returned like a habit the media had never forgotten how to exploit. Every bad throw was no longer seen as a champion's misstep, but as proof that the Super Bowl was just a glitch in history. The whispers came back, then grew into open questions. Was Eli really better than before? Or was he still the same guy shielded by one perfect night? The fragile trust that had just begun to take root started cracking. The Giants still won, still lost, still moved forward. But every failure dragged along the familiar analysis, where Eli was put back on the scale as if the ring had never existed. The most painful thing for Eli wasn't the criticism, it was the feeling of returning to square one. He'd reached a peak many never touch, yet was still treated like an unanswered question. In press conferences, the questions took new forms but carried old content. Could he lead the team again? Was the Super Bowl just an exception? Eli answered, as he always had, calm, brief, showing no emotion. But inside, a different exhaustion began to spread. Not exhaustion from playing, but from having to constantly reprove what he thought he'd already proven. Each week that passed, he took the field with an invisible burden. If he played well, it was expected. If he played poorly, it confirmed doubts that had never left. Victory no longer brought relief. It only delayed the questions for another week. Eli gradually understood that for him, the world's trust wasn't something that could be accumulated. It was like a short-term loan, due quickly and with interest paid through constant perfection. One brilliant moment didn't erase a history of doubt. It only temporarily covered it. And when that cover peeled away, the wound underneath showed more clearly than before. Interceptions were clipped, replayed, dissected from every angle, as if the Super Bowl ring had never existed. Rare praise came with asterisks, conditions, caution. He did it once, but can he do it again? That question haunted Eli more than any direct criticism. It reminded him that in this world, the past doesn't protect you from the present, and glory doesn't grant you the right to fail. Deep down, Eli began to see victory in a different way. The Super Bowl was no longer the liberating peak, but a milestone marking a painful truth. Even when you achieve the unimaginable, the world can still choose to forget. And when they forget, you have to start over from the beginning, with the same doubts, the same scrutinizing looks, the same pre-prepared verdicts. He didn't say this to anyone, not to teammates, not to family, not to the media. He continued living in his familiar silence, carrying the ring like evidence he wasn't allowed to use in self-defense, because, if he mentioned it, he'd be called arrogant. If he leaned on it, he'd be accused of living in the past. And so, Eli kept walking the all-too-familiar path. Work harder, speak less, endure more. But this time, the endurance carried a new layer of bitterness. He understood that he had reached the top of the game, and that still wasn't enough to change the story about him. Victory only brought temporary silence, and when that silence faded, the noise came back louder than before. This was no longer the pain of someone who hadn't proven anything. This was the pain of someone who had proven it, but still wasn't believed. And from that very moment, Eli Manning began stepping into the hardest phase of his career, where he no longer just had to battle opponents on the field, but also the reality that some victories would never be enough to buy lasting acknowledgement. Super Bowl 46 didn't come to Eli Manning like an unexpected miracle, but like a cruel loop of fate. Again, the New England Patriots. Again, Tom Brady. Again, the stage where history waited to be written to a familiar script. Brady, reaffirming his greatness, while Eli played the role of the incidental roadblock. But this time, Eli stepped into that game with a completely different awareness. He no longer believed victory would free him. He no longer believed another ring would change how the world saw him. He took the field not to be loved, but to complete something he couldn't even name. The game unfolded tense, brutal, and Eli played in his familiar way. No showboating, no explosion, but precise and cold when it mattered. The passes in decisive moments, the final life-or-death connection, all came from a man far too accustomed to life-and-death pressure. When the Giants won, when the Patriots fell to him for the second time, history had to bow. Eli Manning was awarded his second Super Bowl MVP. On paper, it was an undeniable affirmation, twice beating the strongest team of the generation, twice honored at the absolute peak, an achievement very few quarterbacks in NFL history have reached. But right in that moment, another truth quietly took shape. History recorded it, but public emotion did not. The praise came with the familiar caution. He's good, but he won. But Peyton was still the perfect genius. Brady was still the great standard. And Eli, even after doing what no one else had done, was still placed in that floating middle ground. People started calling him clutch, but not great. They admitted he was good enough in big moments, but refused to rank him alongside the names already beloved. The second MVP didn't open a new door. It only shut the old one tighter. Eli stood on the podium with his calm smile, but deep inside, he understood this clearly. There would be no third time to prove it. Not because he couldn't win more, but because the world had already decided his story. 2 Super Bowls didn't turn him into a celebrated icon, but into a hard-to-explain exception in history, a winner who didn't fit the mold of greatness the public adored. And right in that moment, a painful acceptance began to sprout. Eli started to understand that some love can't be earned through achievements. Some recognition doesn't come from how much you accomplish, but from how much you resemble the image others want to see. He wasn't like Peyton. He wasn't like Brady. He didn't carry sharp eloquence, didn't carry cold dominance, didn't carry the aura that makes crowds swoon. He only carried endurance, composure, and the ability to stand firm when others fell. And it turned out that wasn't enough to be loved. After Super Bowl 46, Eli stopped trying to change the story about himself. He kept playing, kept doing his job, but no longer held the illusion that one day people would see him differently. That acceptance wasn't giving up, it was a form of self-protection. He understood that if he kept chasing public affection, he'd only wear himself out more. So, he learned to be content with the cold truth. History would record his name, but the hearts of the majority might never belong to him. This was the tragic peak of awareness in Eli Manning's life. Not the moment of defeat, not the years of harshest criticism, but the moment he won for the second time, at the absolute peak, and realized he still stood outside the embrace of adoration. From here, Eli no longer lived, hoping to be loved enough. He lived with the determination to complete his part, accepting the historical place he was allowed, and carrying a very private loneliness, the loneliness of a man who had done everything right, who had won the biggest games, but still had to learn to survive in the absence of public love. After Super Bowl 46, while the outside world continued debating Eli Manning's place in history, there was one space where he didn't have to join that debate. That was family. Not because there he was celebrated, but because there no one demanded he become anything other than himself. Abby McGrew entered Eli's life very early, before he became a name dissected on national television, before New York turned him into the symbol of doubt. Abby didn't love Eli because he was the Giants' quarterback, nor because of the record that would come later. She loved a quiet, awkward in communication man who always tried to do the right thing without anyone watching. In the noisy world of professional football, Abby became the quietest anchor, the one who didn't ask what the press said today, didn't demand he explain why he was criticized, didn't turn failures into dinner table dissections. To Abby, Eli wasn't someone who had to prove his worth, he was someone who needed to be kept whole. But that very piece carried another pain, more subtle, because Eli never allowed his family to see the full extent of his exhaustion. He brought the habit of silence from the field home, like invisible baggage. He smiled with the kids, played, told stories, appeared as a calm and steady father, while inside was a body and mind eroded by years of endurance. Eli didn't want Abby to carry extra worry. He didn't want the kids to grow up with the image of a father always tired, always doubting himself. Family was the refuge. But to keep that refuge safe, Eli accepted hiding his most exhausted part. Becoming a father changed him in ways football never could. The kids didn't care about interceptions, didn't know the rankings, didn't question whether he deserved it or not. To them, Eli was just the dad who was there every night, the one who drove them, listened, tried to keep their world simpler than the one he'd lived in. But that also made Eli set a strict rule for himself. He couldn't fall. Not at home. Not in front of the kids. Not in front of the woman who believed in him when he was still nobody. The pain didn't disappear, it just changed hiding places. It followed him into late evenings when everyone else was asleep. It lay in the moments he sat alone, thinking about the years gone by, about the full cost of the endurance he'd never fully calculated. Family gave him reason to keep going, but also unintentionally forced him to be stronger than necessary. Eli never complained that he was tired, never said there were days he no longer felt like himself, because in his eyes, family deserved protection from every crack the outside world had created. Abby understood that, even though Eli never said it. She saw the fatigue in small gestures, in the way he stayed silent longer after grueling seasons, in the way he avoided unnecessary questions. But she didn't push him to speak. Their love existed in respecting each other's silences, in giving each other space to exist without explanation. And that wordless understanding only highlighted Eli's silent tragedy. He had a loving family, but still had to carry his pain alone. Family was the place he didn't have to prove anything, but also the place he didn't allow himself to be weak. Those two things coexisted, creating a prolonged emotional paradox. Eli found comfort in small things: quiet dinners, mornings driving the kids to school, everyday moments without cameras. But even in those moments, the shadow of the life outside lingered. He knew tomorrow he'd have to take the field again, face the questions, the doubts, the verdicts never fully lifted. Family didn't erase those things, but helped him endure them longer. And right here, Eli's tragedy took a different shape. Not the tragedy of breakdown, but the tragedy of silent sacrifice. He sacrificed the right to complain to keep the family peaceful. He sacrificed the right to be weak, to be the support for those he loved. He didn't live two lives because he wanted to, but because if those two lives collided, one would get hurt. Family was the only place Eli didn't have to prove anything. But to keep that true, he had to keep hiding his most exhausted part. That was the price he accepted paying, not out of duty, but out of love. And in the silence of those peaceful dinners, a quiet truth existed. Eli Manning had everything a man could wish for, but still carried within him the very private loneliness of someone too accustomed to bearing the load without allowing anyone else to share it. As the story of Eli Manning gradually moved away from debates about his historical place and reached the final years on the field, another truth began to emerge, raw and impossible to polish. His body had worn down to the point where it no longer obeyed his will. The repeated collisions, the falls, never replayed on television, The mornings waking up with a stiff neck and a back so painful it took several minutes just to stand straight, all accumulated over the years like a physical debt no title could erase. Eli wasn't the type of quarterback who relied on speed or avoiding contact. He stayed in the pocket longer than was safe, accepted late hits, believing that as long as he completed the pass, any price was worth it. Neck injuries started appearing, nagging and persistent. Chronic back pain lingered, never exploding into disaster, but enough to remind him every day that this body was no longer an infinite tool. Doctors advised rest. Those around him talked about load management. But for Eli, rest carried a different, far more terrifying meaning. Rest meant admitting he was weakening. Rest meant opening the door to doubts that had never truly left. Rest meant wondering if the team still needed him. So he kept taking the field, week after week, turning his consecutive start streak into a form of silent self-punishment. Each game wasn't just a tactical challenge, it was a test of how much longer his body could hold out. Eli didn't talk about the pain. He didn't let it show on his face. He was used to treating discomfort as part of the job, as an unavoidable cost. But the body doesn't care about stories of willpower. It responded with increasingly clear signs. Throws losing power, movements slowing down, moments needing an extra beat to get up after a hit. Eli felt it, but he refused to name it, because naming it would force him to face the question he'd dodged his entire career. If he was no longer healthy enough to play, then who was he? The consecutive start streak, once praised as a symbol of durability, gradually took on a different meaning in Eli's heart. It was no longer an achievement, it was proof he was still useful. Every time he laced up and stepped onto the field was a self-reminder that he was still needed, that the world hadn't moved past him. He didn't allow himself to rest, not because he wasn't in pain, but because he feared the feeling of being replaced more than any injury. In closed practices, away from cameras, Eli spent extra time on recovery, stretching, enduring uncomfortable treatments, as if trying to stretch out a few more weeks, a few more months of the familiar existence. But the harder he tried, the more undeniable signals his body sent. The pain no longer vanished after one night. It stayed, simmering, like a reminder that every athletic life has limits. The tragedy lay in the fact that Eli never allowed that decline to become a public story. He didn't want it used as an excuse, didn't want it explaining any mistakes. He kept standing at the microphone, saying everything was fine, that he was ready for the next game, while inside was a body that had long exceeded its endurance threshold. His willpower was still there, but willpower can't heal flesh and bone. Those final years, each game was a negotiation with himself. How much longer until he couldn't continue? But that question was always pushed to the next week, and the week after. Eli lived in that postponement, dragging it out until his body no longer let him pretend. Eli Manning's physical tragedy didn't come from one horrific injury ending his career in an instant. It came from slow erosion, from the repeated decision that today he could still play, even if tomorrow would hurt more. He didn't rest, because rest meant admitting something he'd never been ready to face, that no matter how strong the will, there are times the body forces you to stop, and when that moment arrives, there's no more negotiating. Eli Manning's final years didn't arrive with a dramatic collapse, but with the quiet shift of a long familiar order. There was no fall that silenced the entire stadium, no career-ending injury, just one morning like any other, when he walked into the training facility and realized the position that had been his for more than a decade was slowly slipping out of reach. The decision to bench him wasn't announced like an event, it was framed as a technical adjustment. The cold language of modern football called it optimization, looking to the future. For Eli, it was the moment the entire world he'd been attached to began operating without him. No one said anything cruel. No one raised their voice, and that very kindness was the hardest to bear, because it gave him no target to fight against. When there's no villain to confront, The pain has nowhere to go but inward. Eli sat on the bench with the same calm face people had grown used to seeing after every interception. But this time, there was no next game to fix things. No press conference to say, "We'll be back next week." Everything closed with neutral words, brief handshakes, averted eyes, no farewell ceremony, no grand night of honor, no moment where the whole stadium rose at once to say thank you. Eli accepted it without a single complaint, the way he'd accepted everything throughout his career. He understood that football didn't owe him gratitude, that this was a game where the past doesn't guarantee the future. But understanding doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. Hurt from the silence, hurt from the feeling of being replaced without a single personal explanation. Hurt from realizing that all those years of endurance, the falls, the biggest games of his life, ultimately ended with a slight nod, as if he'd never occupied any significant emotional space in the team's history. In those final days, Eli still showed up to practice on time, still prepared as if he might be called upon any moment, still supported his teammates with his familiar dedication. He didn't create drama, didn't seek attention for himself, didn't let disappointment show on camera. He understood that if he made a fuss, if he demanded anything, the story about him would be twisted one last time in a way he couldn't control. So he chose to end it the way he'd lived, neatly, quietly, without inconveniencing anyone. When the retirement decision came, it wasn't framed as a historic moment. It arrived as a belated acknowledgement to himself. The body had finished speaking, and so had the world. Eli didn't demand a stage. He didn't need promises of immortality. He only needed to leave in order, without breaking the peace he'd worked so hard to maintain for 30 years. Some players leave the field to cheers, carrying the feeling of having been loved enough. Eli left with a different feeling. He'd done enough. No more. No less. And sometimes, doing enough is its own rare form of courage. In the days that followed, when he no longer had to wear the uniform, no longer had a packed training schedule, no longer had the pressure of answering the same repeated questions, Eli faced an emptiness he'd never had time to feel before. No one was waiting for him to make a mistake anymore. No one was waiting for him to prove anything. The quiet came slowly, and when it arrived, it was both relieving and painful. Relieving, because he no longer had to brace himself against the world. Painful because he realized he'd grown so used to carrying the load that he didn't know what to do when it was set down. Eli Manning's final years didn't etch themselves into public memory with explosive moments. They passed like a whispered ending, true to the man he was. No farewell, no grand tributes, no promises of greatness. Just a man stepping off the field as if he'd never wanted to take up space for too long. And in that silence, there's an undeniable truth. Eli Manning accepted his ending the way he'd lived his entire life, not bothering anyone, but carrying the full price of endurance that very few ever truly saw. After retiring, Eli Manning stepped away from the NFL, not like a winner seeking new spotlight, but like someone who had just escaped a locked room that had kept him inside for far too long. No more training schedules, no more press conferences, no more stats waiting to be dissected every morning. For the first time in decades, he could breathe without wondering how that breath would be interpreted. But that relief didn't arrive in pure joy. It carried a quiet sadness, because when the final door closed, Eli realized he had lived braced for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be himself. Manningcast came into being in that context, not as a carefully calculated project, but as a safe space where Eli could exist without having to prove anything. On screen, people saw a different Eli for the first time. Funny, self-deprecating, relaxed, even occasionally awkward. He laughed at old mistakes, recounted moments that once drew heavy criticism in a surprisingly light tone. That laughter wasn't to hide pain. It was the only way he knew to process it, when it was too late to change anything. The public began saying they understood Eli better, that he wasn't cold or emotionless after all. He just never had the space to be himself. But that belated understanding carried a bitter paradox. Because when the world finally saw the real Eli, that man was no longer standing on the field. 30 years of living two lives couldn't be undone with a few hours of laughter on television. Humor became a late healing mechanism, a way for Eli to make peace with himself, but it was also a reminder that most of his life had passed in silence and restraint. What viewers saw now was a lighter man, but also one who had gone through too much to ever reclaim the years he had traded away. Eli didn't resent the lateness. He understood that if he'd been allowed to be himself earlier, he probably wouldn't have survived that brutal environment. The silence, the suppression, the feigned composure had once been survival tools, and now, when those tools were no longer needed, he finally allowed himself to set them aside. But every laugh, every self-mocking jab at the past, was also Eli touching parts of his life that had never been fully lived. He saw the stark contrast between the man he was now and the man from before, one who spoke little out of fear of being misunderstood, and one who spoke freely because there was nothing left to lose. Manningcast brought him joy, but it also exposed an uncomfortable truth. Eli Manning had to wait until all the pressure ended before he was permitted to be Eli Manning. The public loved this version, but that love arrived when he no longer needed it. The lost years couldn't be recovered. The games already played couldn't be replayed with a different mindset, and the moments when he once suppressed emotion to survive would forever remain in a place beyond reach. After retirement, Eli could breathe, but it was the breath of someone who had walked a long road in low oxygen. He enjoyed the peace, but he also carried the clear awareness that this peace came too late to soothe everything. The tragedy now was no longer sharp pain, it was sedimentation. No screaming, no brooding, just a gentle but persistent regret. Eli Manning was finally seen, understood, loved in a more authentic way. But the price of that moment was 30 years gone, by 30 years when he had to live as an edited version to fit the world. And in that relief, there was an undeniable truth. Sometimes healing arrives when the wound has become part of who you are, no longer aching, but never disappearing. Eli Manning was never the GOAT, and perhaps he never even wanted to be called that. He didn't possess the numbers that force instant reverence, didn't have the commanding presence that silences stadiums before the snap, didn't carry the aura that makes media defend him at all costs. He wasn't celebrated like Peyton, worshipped like Brady, loved enough by any emotional measure of the American public. But there is one thing very few people dare to look straight at. Eli Manning stood firm for 30 years in an unforgiving world where a single moment of weakness meant being swallowed without mercy. And to stand that firm, he paid the full price, not through a tragic collapse, but through the slow erosion of his sense of self, his emotions, his right to be himself. Eli never fell because he never allowed himself to fall. But that very refusal to fall was the most expensive price. He grew up in a family where excellence was the bare minimum standard, where no one forced him to become anything, but everything around him made him understand that ordinary wasn't an option. He entered the NFL with a label that never truly belonged to him, compared even when he didn't lose, doubted even when he won. He carried New York on his shoulders, a city that doesn't wait for anyone to mature, has no patience for silence, forgives no repeated mistakes. He learned to stay silent to survive, learned not to defend himself to avoid being torn apart further, learned to endure as a survival skill. His 2 Super Bowl rings didn't free him from that story. They only made it more complicated, because history had to record them while public emotion still turned away. Eli won the biggest games of his life, but he never won the right to be loved unconditionally. Family was the only place he didn't have to prove anything, but it was also where he hid his deepest exhaustion to protect those he loved. His body eroded bit by bit, But he never allowed himself to rest because rest meant admitting he could be replaced. His final career years closed in silence. No farewell ceremony, no grand tribute moment, as if he had never occupied enough emotional space for anyone to miss him. And then, after retirement, when for the first time Eli could breathe, could laugh, could be himself in public, that relief came with an unnameable sadness. Too late to reclaim the 30 years lost. Humor became late healing, but it was also a mirror reflecting everything he had to suppress to survive. Looking back at the entire journey, Eli Manning's tragedy isn't that he wasn't recognized enough, it's that he had to trade away so much just to stand firm. He had no dramatic collapse for the world to pity, no scandal to explain away with circumstance, no loud tragedy to be embraced. He only had quiet endurance, something that never generates prolonged applause. But that endurance is the hardest thing in a culture that glorifies explosion and despises quiet. Eli isn't the heroic model. People like to tell their kids about the American dream. He's the more uncomfortable version of truth, that some people do everything right, endure every pressure, win enough big games, and still never get loved enough. But they keep standing not for glory, but because if they fell, they'd lose themselves. Eli Manning didn't live two lives because he wanted to. He lived that way because if he had lived only one, he wouldn't have made it. And that is his true legacy. Not celebrated greatness, but the full capacity to exist in a world that never made room for softness. Not a beloved legend, but a man who paid the full price to stand until the very end. The story of Eli Manning leaves behind a very distinctive sadness of modern America. The sadness of a man who did everything right, but was never loved enough. The most heartbreaking part isn't that Eli wasn't called the GOAT, it's that he had to live two parallel lives to survive. One life on the field, where he carried New York's pressure, dissected for every interception, every decision, every facial expression, and one inner life, where he learned silence, no self-defense, no demands, to keep himself from collapsing. His two Super Bowl wins over the undefeated Patriots, especially the helmet catch moment, and the second MVP should have been liberation. But as the story has shown, they only bought temporary silence, never lasting trust. When he was benched in his final years without a farewell, when his body eroded from neck and back injuries, but he still didn't dare rest, Eli showed the real cost of durability in a harsh achievement culture. Family with Abby and the kids was the only place he didn't have to prove anything, but it was also where he continued hiding his deepest exhaustion to protect others. Only after retirement, through Manningcast, did the public see a humorous, authentic Eli, and ironically, that was when it was too late to give back the 30 years lost. The lesson for Americans isn't try harder, but to look again at how we judge people. Success doesn't equal being understood. Endurance shouldn't be mistaken for indifference. Eli's story reminds us that society needs to learn to value those who stand firm in silence, and that being loved enough sometimes matters no less than winning. If the story of Eli Manning made you pause for a moment to think about the price of endurance and what people must endure in silence, please subscribe to the channel to join us on the next journeys. Thank you for listening to the end, and see you in the next video, where stories that seem glorious will continue to be told with the deepest truth.